Great. Should we wheel ourselves to the back? Or?
Yeah.
Heidi, do you want to do the intro?
Oh my gosh, okay.
Sorry, we're so.
Welcome everybody. Thank you for Zooming. Thank you for coming in person. We have an exciting exhibition here at Ava that I'm so thrilled to be introducing you to. We have for Sage on our list of artists to have here in the galleries for how many years now?
I think it's close to 3.
Yeah, close to 3 years because of the pandemic, and she's been patient with us, and her patience paid off because she's got this wonderful space, these 2 different galleries to put her installation in, and to put her static work in as well. So when I saw this work on film, you know, when you take pictures and submit it, I kind of went, ooh. But when you see it in person, it is so fetching, and it's so amazing. So I'm really excited that we can see it kind of in 3D and in person. I'm so glad that you're here. Sage recently completed a project space residency at the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, New York. So you can imagine that's where some of this was inspired by. She also had a 10-month residency as an artist in resident fellowship at the Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar, of all places. How unusual. So I can't wait to hear about that. While in Qatar, she set up a dark room for students to learn analog processes. So for those of you who aren't aware of what goes on in photography, analog processes are when you get your hands kind of in the water, and you're developing film, and you're developing prints, and you know, the old-fashioned way, as opposed to digital, which is really unusual in this day and age. And to do those processes has a whole different, very tactile feel to it that we don't have in modern-day digital photography. So this is also very exciting. She received a faculty research grant to study and teach the process of carbon printing. So work that Sage created in Qatar has spurred her current research and the work in her Ava exhibit entitled Mosaic. Really inspiring work, and some of the thought processes behind it are very exciting too. Sage holds an MFA in painting and drawing from the Ohio State University and a BFA in painting and art history from Maine College of Art. You are a Vermont-based artist, but you're currently living in Brooklyn, New York. Is that still true?
Vermont and Brooklyn.
Yeah, back and forth, yeah. So without further ado, and I'm just going to give one other plug, is you really do need to come see this work in person to be able to appreciate it. And Sage's exhibition is beautiful, and the other exhibitions in the galleries are beautiful. So do yourself a favor, it's safe. We have all the safety protocols in place here at Ava, except for me right now, because I want you to be able to hear and understand what I'm saying. But everyone here in the audience is masked. We're separated, spaced out. We have contact tracing, so please come by. It's safe, and we want to see you here. So without further ado, let's welcome Sage.
Thank you, Heidi, so much. And we are going to start in the back space, but I also just wanted to start by thanking Heidi and Sam and the staff at Ava. It's been really amazing to work with you all, and I have felt very supported in the process of pulling together this show during the pandemic with everything going on, and with some of the more experimental things that I wanted to do with the installation. So it's been a real pleasure and a real honor to be able to work with you all. So thank you so much for that. And I think we will kind of move ourselves into the back space. So I wanted to just start in this space where I have a video piece which I'll talk about and a silk installation on the wall. And I wanted to start by just talking about these two framed pieces because they really sort of tell the origin of my interest in geology, landforms, and rocks in particular. And the reason that that sort of came about was during the year that I spent living in Qatar, which is a mostly desert landscape and very flat. So it's in contrast, obviously, to Vermont, which is very mountainous, where I grew up, and usually very lush and covered with greenery. So one of the things that struck me being there was noticing the actual surface of the earth and the shape of the earth. And so I became aware of landscape as the actual earth itself, as a planetary body, rather than, I think we often think about landscape as an immersive space that kind of surrounds us. So especially when there's a lot of flora and fauna and you're surrounded by lush kind of growth, you feel like this immersive sense of landscape. And I became aware of the land and the earth as a form of landscape in a broader way. And I also became very aware of my position on the earth, on the other side of the earth. So looking at my phone, looking at Google Maps, and becoming aware of the information that was being transmitted to me from above via satellites, and kind of orienting us to where we are in our location on the planet. And then for me, that was on the other side of the planet from where I had come. So that awareness of the earth as a planetary body, my position, and also the information from above, and wanting to feel very connected to where I was on the ground, kind of led me to this experience of looking at the ground and wanting to just start from close in, if you will, and start from just what I could know in this very kind of small, minute way. So I went outside and I was gathering rocks and stones and pebbles and dirt, and I placed them on the flatbed scanner. And that's how I made these images. So the scanner is kind of another way to make images aside from the camera, and it's very connected to a sense of touch and the surface, because is the audio okay? Yeah, okay. So there's the way that the scanner operates is that there's a layer of glass, and whatever is touching that surface is what is going to be in sharp detail in the image. And then the parts of the rocks or stones or dirt that were not touching the surface would not be picked up in that way. They would be out of focus or fuzzy. So I was very interested in that effect and also kind of the quality of light that I could achieve. And in making these prints, I was also starting to experiment with using digital processes to layer imagery. So there's one layer of print on the first layer, and then there's another layer, which is this darker shape that you see on both of these. And this darker shape was printed using a UV printer. So it's a different printing technology that applies a shiny surface, and it uses UV rays to heat the ink. So it has a very different sheen, and you can see that if you look at the side of the print and you sort of walk around it, you can kind of get a sense of the layers. And that's something that we'll see again when we look at the silk pieces. I really like to create a sense of the image itself changes as you walk around it. So it is kind of in relationship to your body as you're seeing it. So I think a lot of the works in this show are very much coming from that place of being in this unfamiliar place, wanting to orient, but also wanting to kind of revel in the inability to really know a place. And I felt like I could start to kind of know my surroundings really by feeling my way around on the surface of the earth, and how I could sort of continue to do that through working with images that related directly to the surface of the earth. So we think a lot about with printmaking and the history of printmaking, which I've done a lot of. There's this kind of flatbed of the printmaking press, and there's the kind of flatness of the picture plane. And so in many of these pieces, I'm sort of conflating those two things, so that the surface of, whether it's the silk and the kind of interference of the moire patterns that happen, they relate directly to the surface of that, relates directly to these kind of perceptual effects that I would notice in the landscape, with heat waves rising off the surface of the earth and kind of interrupting the clarity of your view, and also a kind of sense of being in a place with a different atmosphere. And there was a lot of dust and sand in the air that was just kind of imperceptible, but when you look at the sun, you would sort of see like the circle of the sun rather than just the bright light. So there were things like that that I noticed that started making their way into the works. And I think I'll just move over to the video here. So
You're good.
So the video is 15.5 minutes long. It's a very sort of meditative, I feel, kind of slow-paced, moving image collage. So I sort of think of the video and the process of making it like a collage or some of the two-dimensional works that I made, but with movement. So this section actually is a rock under my microscope that is going in and out of focus. So I have a small microscope that can make small videos. And the still image, an example on the left, that's kind of lavender colored, is one of the images from the Viking landers that were on Mars in the 1970s. So this is also some footage that I shot, basically of sand with colored filters waving in the breeze. So kind of using the actual nature, wind, to create experimental videos there. And when I returned from Qatar, I came across a book of photographs from Mars, and these are from the Spirit and Opportunity rovers around 2006. And so I came across this book. It was actually at the Bear Pond bookstore in Montpelier. It was a large hardcover, glossy, beautiful, very enticing photos. And they were all photographs from Mars. And I thought that was really interesting because it made me think about what makes a photograph, for one thing, given that humans haven't been to Mars. And also, what comprises a landscape? How do we think about composition and light and space in a very earthly way? How that can be translated to images that we've never seen before with our own eyes. So seeing that book actually triggered this kind of intense feeling of nostalgia. When I was looking at the images, I felt really transported back to Qatar and to this particular more remote area that I spent a lot of time photographing. And I wanted to kind of experience that feeling that I felt there again, but also with the distance of memory, of physical distance, knowing that I couldn't physically access it anymore because I wasn't in the country at that time. And so that kind of led me towards thinking more about planetary imaging. And I went even further back beyond the Spirit and Opportunity rovers to the first images that we received from Mars, which were from the Viking landers. And it was fascinating to me to think about the history of photography in the 60s and 70s, and that these rovers were there at a time that was really a kind of hybrid between digital hadn't really become what we know it is today, and analog photo processes were still being used. So even though the landers had this kind of vertical scanning mechanism that they used to create the image data that was transmitted back, the images that they were then assembled into were actually printed on analog silver gelatin paper. So it was kind of this really interesting mix of imaging media and processes, which is something that I'm very interested in. So it was, it's been a whole rabbit hole that I've really enjoyed learning more about over the years. So still images from the Viking landers are seen in this video. This is like the white piece is kind of like the weather station that was on the lander. And so being able to kind of work with those in my work through this process has been really great. They're very, very tiny images, but they come in all these different forms. So in terms of like books that are digitized by Google and, you know, JPEGs that you can download from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, as well as actual silver gelatin materials. So I think we'll pivot. We could maybe show the Zoomers some more of the video later on, but I'll pivot over to talk about the silk. So this is a 7-panel silk. I guess you could say collage, because the 7 panels kind of come together to make the one image. This also connects a little bit in terms of composition to the title of the show, which is Mosaic. And I was thinking with the title about planetary imaging and how technicians on Earth will receive small bits of image data, covering a very small amount of surface from either the moon or Mars, and they will piece it together to create a larger panoramic view or a larger image that kind of makes more sense in terms of how we think of landscape. So that's a process that they call mosaicing. And in the traditional mosaics as well, it's, you know, it's in a larger image that's composed of these much smaller parts. So it's sort of thinking about the scale shift between the parts that compose an image and then the overall image has been kind of an ongoing theme for me, and so that's where the title of the show comes from. This piece is actually a video still. So I've been working on this 15-minute video on and off for the last couple of years. And there's a section in the video that includes footage of me projecting an image in my studio. And the projector technology, which is a DLP projector, so it uses this spinning color wheel to make the image, and it shines light through that wheel, rather than an LCD projector, which, you know, I won't get into that. But the technology of the projector is embedded in this projection of the video, because I captured it on my camera. And if you're taking video of a DLP projector, you can sort of see the waves of the color at certain speeds in the video. And so that's where this color comes from. So this bright yellow, pink, and these colors here come from me projecting in my studio, and then that footage ended up in the video. And then I took a still from the video and I divided it into these 7 panels and printed these on silk. And one of the things I was thinking about is how the silk overlaps. When it overlaps another layer, it does create those warring patterns. So there is both like this kind of sense of, if I can like move across it and make it move a little bit, there's a sense of the image shifting in space. And then there's also this kind of optical thing that happens where you're maybe not sure what's in front and what is behind. And your eye really wants to focus on some of the sharper details, like, you know, is this rock and this shadow? But there's kind of, I think, a nice push-pull there where you're not necessarily able to define shapes entirely. And so hopefully it makes you want to look more closely and just kind of also notice more of like the texture, the weave of the silk, and the kind of interference effects. Another thing I'll say about this, because it leads over to the next piece, is that this here is a color calibration test strip that was on the Viking lander. And so the lander would kind of point its sensors at this color calibration test strip, which if you see it in color, these are all different colors and black and white. And that was one of the ways in which they were able to sort of layer the images back on Earth in order to put together color images. And there was a lot of debate at the time in the 70s when these images were coming back about, is the sky blue, and is that the color how we would see it with our own eyes? And are we adjusting, you know, for atmospheric effects that we expect to see on Earth and things like that. So that whole experience of color and the subjective nature of it, and just the inability to really know with our own eyes on Mars. I mean, that's one of the things that intrigues me about it, is the fact that we really can't go there. So, so this is something that features in the next set of works that we'll talk about, which is just going to be outside this wall here.
Oh.
So I also should have mentioned in the beginning that if there are any questions for those of you who are watching on Zoom, you can put questions in the chat and we have someone monitoring the chat. So that can be a way to share questions and kind of have a conversation. And we're just going to swap out the batteries on this mic. And if anyone in person has questions, you're also welcome to ask.
Those ones are dead too.
So now would
You
be a
can
really
continue
good
on.
time.
One thing I had a question about on the video. At one point, there was a lot of texture of like little white dots all the way through it. What was that?
So that was actually in one of the Viking lander images, and a lot of the images have these kind of white dots that appear, and it's missing information basically. So it's kind of like what we might think of as pixels, but it wasn't pixels, but it was missing data. And sometimes they appear as these vertical lines.
Yeah, so some of those.
And so the vertical lines feature strongly just as a compositional device. I sort of picked up on that in those images and have used them. But I also was using them in some of my work before, so I guess it was a natural fit because, you know, if you look at the pieces, the silk pieces that are in strips.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
The other question I had, obviously you didn't have the shape that the wall is, that the video is being projected on.
Yeah, yeah.
So was that kind of fun to set that up and
Yes.
decide?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm glad you brought it up because there are a lot of angles in the gallery space in architecture. I don't know if there's even a 90-degree really true. Well, in this old textile mill building, so it was a fun space to work with, and you know, I spent a lot of time in the space well before the show, just kind of looking at all the walls, sort of from top to bottom, and kind of getting a sense of the architecture. And with the video projection, we weren't sure, but we wanted to just play around with it. And as soon as we set it up, Sam was with me, and we both agreed that it was really adding something interesting to the composition in the video, and so many of the moments in the video are kind of like moving in this way that makes it appear as though it's like a three-dimensional shape. So I love looking at the video and not being able to tell if the wall is kind of angled in or angled out. So that was really nice.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool.
I just got a question about the video also. I know that you have some shots of Death Valley in there, and I wondered what the connection that you made between
Yeah, so there are some moments of Death Valley. There are some moments of flying, excuse me, flying over Southern California in an airplane, kind of like taking some video out of just the airplane window. And there are a lot of places on Earth where there are, you know, characteristics that are analogous to Mars, and the Mojave Desert and Death Valley is one of them. So places where they have actually, you know, they will test rovers and kind of conduct experiments closer to the Pasadena Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Can be really located. So that was part of the draw of Death Valley. But also, I think really there are so many places. There's a lot of Maine that shows up in this gallery, and the geology of Stonington, Maine, where I did a residency. And so there are a lot of places where I think you can really feel that connection, both to the Earth and also to the Earth as a planetary body and to other planets. There are a lot of locations all over the Earth, including under the ocean, where there are places that are considered to be space analogs, caves and things like that too. So, so I think that really just being in an unfamiliar place, having that heightened sense of awareness of being an explorer is really more what it's about rather than a specific location for me. Okay, so maybe we'll switch spots a little bit. I can move. Is it better if I move over here? So, or do you want to be over here?
I think it's okay right
Okay.
here.
So I just wanted to briefly talk about these four pieces because they bring a different element of time into the exhibition. They're on an unfixed silver gelatin paper, which relates back to that analog process of photo history that we were talking about. And because they're not fixed with a chemical fixer, the color tone of the paper is changing with light. So there's ambient light that's affecting it. And when I installed these a few weeks ago, they were definitely different colors. Not drastically different, but a much brighter sort of pink magenta And these again are kind of focusing in on stills from the video where I have the color test strip. And in doing some research on this color process that the Viking landers used, I discovered that these were called true color. So they had like sets of images that they would call true color versus false color, where they would sort of try to alter or highlight certain minerals or kind of dramatize the image a bit. So I just enjoyed playing off that name, true color, and kind of the whole inability to really pin down what that is. And sort of the nature of truth in photography anyway, which I think is always changing and always an interesting subject for me. Position myself here. So maybe we can look. Maybe we can look at the cell. Thanks everyone on Zoom for bearing with all of the technology. I hope you're getting some sense of the show. But I have another silk piece here in the front gallery, and this piece comes from a print called Spectral Viewer, which is on the opposite wall, so we can show that in a bit. The print is smaller, it's 11 by 14, and the print has layers of spray paint on the paper and then multiple layers of printing the imagery over it. So it's a multi-layered, unique print, and I made a very high-res scan of that so that I could print it large on the silk. But I tell you all of that to kind of bring back that idea of the image layering and the collage, which I feel like is very much a part of the video, the silk pieces, kind of all the different works. And the subject matter in this front gallery and in this piece is a little more varied. I'm not working with the Mars lander images up here, but I'm working more with my own explorations of geology. So this was taken, the imagery for this was taken from Stonington, Maine, on a residency that I did there. And there's a lot of amazing geology along the coast of Maine that's also really evident. And so I spent a lot of time photographing there, and a number of the, all of the paper sculptures that are on this taller pedestal, which we'll show in a minute, are from that series from Maine. A number of the framed works on the wall are also from that series in Maine, combined with other works from Joshua Tree, California. So I think, again, with this piece, I would just say that it really changes depending on your position to it. So if you look at it really from kind of a more extreme side angle, you can see that the color kind of condenses in a way that makes it a lot more saturated and sharper. And then again, there are some areas where it overlaps, making those kind of darker vertical strips. So I think with the framed works, there are a number of them which are assemblages. So they're actually cut pieces that I have fit perfectly together, edge to edge, like a jigsaw puzzle. And they're sort of attached with a Japanese paper mending tape that I used on the back side. And it's a little bit different from collage because there's no overlap, but it is still bringing together parts of images that come from disparate sources. So in some cases, there will be imagery from different landscapes in different locations brought together in the same picture plane. And one of the things I was thinking about conceptually related to that is this idea of glacial erratics in geology, which are kind of evidence of times when a certain rock formation, you know, when the plates of the earth are in a different position, leaving evidence of rock formations that sort of don't belong there anymore in our current iteration of this earth. And there were quite a few of those around Scudic Point in Maine, which is part of Acadia National Park that I was photographing. So that's one of the things I was thinking about, but also just in terms of my process in the studio, collage is really a way that I work a lot. It just makes sense to me to work with my hands and to bring things together and then see what happens and to kind of do it without planning or thinking so much. So with the sculptures, I will just say, and we'll turn to those, but I made the sculptures and I had a lot of pieces left over. And that is ultimately what ended up becoming the pieces that are framed on the wall. So let me just, yeah, I think now would be a good time to talk about the sculptures and then we can kind of open it up to questions. So these are paper sculptures on this pedestal and the shorter one. And it sort of worked out that this grouping are all, in terms of imagery from the series that I did from the Maine, photographing of Maine. And the other grouping are all from Joshua Tree, California, National Park. So it's sort of, as I was grouping them together and placing them, it wasn't necessarily intentional, but I noticed that that was happening and it kind of made sense. They are formerly three-dimensional geometric shapes that I flattened in a printmaking press. And now they are magnetically held to these magnetite rocks. So in the process of flattening the sculptures, there are these kind of areas where the paper folded in on itself and created a lot of creases. And so in those creases are where I'm able to kind of insert these tiny, very strong rare earth magnets. And those are what holds the paper to the rock. And the sculptures were designed in these geometric forms, which I designed using a program on my computer, very simple, but it would basically allow me to design an interesting shape with as many kind of facets as I wanted it to have, and create a template to cut and score the shape. And then I would use material that I printed. So I consider the paper to be the material. So I would print these large sheets of paper according to kind of the sizes that I needed. And then I would create little tabs that would hold the glue, that as I was scoring the shapes with a ruler, everything had to be very exact or it would not come together as a whole. So as I was doing that, you know, I would use this archival glue. So it's this very kind of labored process, and make the shape as perfectly as I possibly can. And then I took them over to the Two Rivers printmaking studio in White River. And I would put them on the flatbed printing press and crank them through the press until they were super flat. So as flat as I could possibly get them. And I really just wanted to see with the image on the three-dimensional shape, you know, what would happen when I compressed it that thin, and then it would basically reveal a different image than what I started with. So I was very open to the imagery kind of being more interesting than what I had before, or less interesting in some cases. It was more about seeing what happened. And for a few years, I've been trying to figure out, you know, if I would show these pieces, because they're different from other works that I've made, or if I would show them, how would I show them, because they are double-sided. And so I finally figured out that I could show them with these magnetite rocks and kind of give them a resting place that was also sort of related to their content and meaning, coming from the earth and looking at geology and the wonder of it. So that's how these came about, and I think I'll end it there and see if people have questions either on Zoom or in person.
I do have a question, just what your relationship to the silk is. You know, perhaps it's that way that you it's been,
Yeah. So the question was, what is my relationship to the silk? And it definitely does have to do with kind of physical interaction with the image. I think it's also about wanting to break down the image and have it be more than a static thing. So I've always been really drawn to textiles and the weave itself as a kind of grid structure. And so I chose this silk in a way because the weave is very apparent, and it really does become part of the image. Like the space between you know, the work and the weft is actually quite large. So it really kind of allows a lot of air to pass through and light to pass through. So it becomes a completely different thing, and I like that characteristic of it.
If you envision that permanent installation, what would you envision?
Permanent, like if this were going to be on view for 20 years or something like that. I mean, in terms of the image and the material, it's all archival as inkjet printing is. So yeah, I personally like, I like having space between the silk and the wall. So, you know, that's one thing, is that, you know, it could be mounted with spacers, and that's what I've done just with the pins. But in a more permanent installation, I think kind of a clear spacer that would hold it out a little bit and allow that air to pass through. Yeah, it definitely changes a lot if it's like pressed up against the wall, and it's also interesting, but it's very different.
I have a question about your sculpture. When you were so intricately piecing it together to be a three-dimensional shape, Did you know you were going to flatten them, or did that idea come later?
I had flattened sculptures before,
Uh-huh.
so this was my first rodeo in that sense. And when I did it in the past, I was working with much larger pieces. So like 3 or 4 feet long, and these are much more intimate, and I honestly left it open. I wasn't sure. Just knowing that I had done that before, you know, it was definitely in my mind, but I photographed these before they were flattened as well. So I tend to do a lot of setups in my studio. I'll have like some kind of printed thing. Sometimes it's fabric, sometimes it's paper. And then I'll put some sculpture that I made on that and kind of see what that looks like and photograph it like a little scene. So I was sort of thinking maybe they would stay, you know, sculptures full, like 3-dimensional in that way, and then maybe they would be flattened. Yeah, I think I wasn't sure what I was looking at.
And then after they were flattened, did you start to think like, how am I going to show these, and how did you come up with the magnets, and also maybe it's not so important that they're displayed exactly the same way every time you show them?
Yeah,
Just curious
it's
about
not important, but I think what is important is the pedestals that they're on. And so maybe we can kind of show this one to the zoomers a sense of the shape. So I designed the pedestals to be the strongest shape. In kind of keeping with the geometry that these pieces started off with. So none of them were just kind of like organic forms. They started off in the sculptures that I made as being these very geometric, hard edge, measure, ruler, cut, assembled pieces. And then they're flattened into these much more like organic, kind of free-form looking shapes. So the rhombus shape and the geometry of that is kind of connected back to that kind of origin of designing sculptures in the geometric forms. Yeah. But it's been fun playing with them in different ways, but I also think they can be shown in different positions for sure. I mean, it's the double-sided nature of them. It's like, I really love the other side of this one, but it just worked out like with the shape of the rock and the shape of this piece that's how it's shown here. So. Any questions on Zoom?
Oh, here it is. We've got some chats. Let's see. So hi, Sage. I was wondering if you could talk more about the concept of the found versus the made, specifically in relation to your sculptures on the wooden pedestals.
Okay, that's a really good question.
Found versus the made.
Yeah. So obviously the found are the magnetite rocks, and they serve the very important purpose of being magnetic, to allow me to hold the sculpture that I made. So it's kind of a platform on a platform in a way, but they also, you know, coming from the earth and being related and connected, I think, to technology that we use every day in, you know, computers and cell phones and all kinds of industrial processes. I think that's an interesting connection as well that the rocks kind of bring into it. These are minerals, and you know, so I'm not necessarily like investigating kind of magnetization or lining, things like that, but I think that they serve a purpose for me that's both visual and connected to the things that I think about when I'm actually in these places making these images. I also think that in flattening the sculptures, there's a layering of the image, a compression of the image that happens. And you can see it when you look at the edges, where you know that there's image that's under there, right? Because this was actually like a dodecagon or something, and now it's flat. So there are these kind of passages of image that are buried under there. And I feel that that's also true for sure in thinking about geology and landforms and folding, especially folding is something I do a lot in the studio, and kind of thinking about the image as a malleable form and the earth as a malleable form as well, and how these like layers and folds of history and how they're compressed into these objects.
Fantastic. So I have another question for you. This is from Laura Graff. She says, so interesting that the photographs will change with exposure to light. And will they ever become completely dark, or are they fixed at a certain point?
Well, they won't become black, but I think they will eventually become something between like a really warm gray and a cooler gray. There's a warm tone paper that I used that's the more like pink lavender color tone, and there's a cool tone paper that's the bluer ones. And so I think that they will become just kind of more gray out, if you will, but not totally black. But it's also kind of an experiment for me, because I haven't, I've certainly seen plenty of exposed photo paper in my time, but I haven't just let the paper go like this before. And the show is up for June 4th, so come see.
Which is, it's so nerve-wracking as a photographer who, I started in photography with analog, and it's like the cardinal sin to let your paper get exposed to light. So it's very nerve-wracking, but at the same time intriguing to see what's going to happen. I really love it. Can you talk to us a little bit about, and you may have, if you want to hit your head against the wall, please do. You don't have to answer. But how has the pandemic changed your outlook? Are you thinking of doing a different type of artwork because of it? Are you changing the way you complete your artwork and work in the studio? What has been the effect on you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I will still be figuring out in this next year, because I think that making art during the last year was very kind of fraught at times. You know, just it was difficult to focus. It was difficult to find that ability, and I think something changed for me kind of last November, and it actually became something that was kind of pulling me out of this kind of dead zone I felt. So it became, you know, what I needed again, which was really great. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is just, you know, making work and kind of following all these lines of inquiry is something that I do, I think my artist friends, we kind of all do alone in a way, even if we work with other artists or collaborative and things like that, but it's, I mean, it's very much like being in our bodies and how we are essentially alone in our own experience. And I don't really mean that in a morbid way or anything, but I do think that the more ways in which we can share that, and I think I'm trying to think for myself about other ways that can happen, because I think since the pandemic, finding those moments in the way to share and have conversations that are more meaningful than maybe what we're used to with everyday life seems more important to me now.
Yeah. I'm curious, did you purposely choose not to put sound with your film? And if you could put a soundtrack to this exhibition, what would you put? What would be the music?
Sound is something I definitely want to explore with in conjunction with the video and the composition. And video work is somewhat new for me, so I have made and completed one prior video to this one. And in that one, I used basically like the native sound. It was me turning these rolls of paper on a tabletop, so there was this kind of just sound of the rolls moving, and the images are sort of going in and out of focus. So I'm kind of interested in more minimal sound, but I'm also interested in, like, particularly with this video, because it is 15 minutes long, what sound might feel like in terms of transporting you to these other places. So I think that can be really powerful. It's something I'm excited to kind of think about now in the future. But I think I'm more drawn, I would say, to more like atmospheric sound that almost like I think of if you are walking in the forests and you hear the trees creaking, and there are, these kind of like almost imperceptible sounds that kind of make you think like, what was that? What was the origin of that? 'Cause it sounded like it could be some kind of technology, but it could also have come from those trees. So I think of things that maybe you can't quite define, I guess.
Yeah.
Shape.
Yeah.
I noticed that in the work that we were looking at today, that there's this reminder that we see things from our own perspective, and that we're not seeing the same thing that other people are seeing. It can't. And we never can see the object completely. It's always from the perspective. I hate it's there in almost everything. It's clear as here with the sculptures, of course. And the ones that I like and highlight for me is when you walk in front of the screen. And just you're walking in front of the screens change the art. And the cleverness with the film, but that's not really seen from a human perspective, it's from a machine. And yet you turn it into something that does change with human perspective. And I really like that a lot. But I wondered why that's important to you. And I also wondered, because I also like very much your description at the beginning of your work, looking down at the graph on the other side of the world, on the other side of the planet, if there's a connection.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yeah, I think there definitely is a connection. I think that for me, looking down and thinking about the surface of the image, kind of allowed me to think about some of the technical processes of image making that I was learning. The carbon printing, for example, which is layered with gelatin, and the surface of the image actually kind of like peels off with the material. And I was thinking about looking at the ground, and if sometimes I would photograph these rocks that were so black they looked like holes, and thinking about the surface of the ground is almost like a portal in a way that could open up another surface underneath. And so that was one of the ways that I was thinking about geology and the image, or the surface of the image, as a kind of layered geological form in and of itself, because there is dimension to all printed material. And we kind of take them in as a surface, but there is actually a dimension there. And there's always a relationship with any print to the contact of the printer, whatever that is, whether it's like a copper plate or gel. So that contact connection, but I think that the interest in the changing perception part of it, and I mean, it reflects my own personal experience of, you know, being in situations where you might be very disoriented and unable to kind of understand the scale of your body in relation to a landscape, for example, and a kind of vastness of space, which I think is essentially all of our positions if you think about the scale of the universe. So employing those kind of scale shifts to alter one's ideas or perceptions about horizon or parameters of the space. It's interesting. So I think the perceptual shifts and wanting to show these kind of changes, for me as a viewer, they connect me to my body in space if something changes as I'm viewing it. But also I think reflect that position that we're in, where it's sort of this constant unknowing. And it's almost like the closer that we get to something, then maybe the less we know about it. So it's that constantly shifting condition.
Good, thank you.
Well, Sage, there's one more comment, and that was from here we go. From Laura Graff as well. She said, "Thank you, Sage. Love art that changes, just like us."
Yeah.
So, thank you so much for being here with us and sharing. You talk about your art so beautifully and articulately, for sharing your processes, your thoughts, the reasons behind everything. And I will say that, again, you have to be here to see this artwork. It's really stunning in person. And I encourage everyone to come to AVA. We have another gallery talk happening on Saturday. And that's in conjunction with our mental health month awareness exhibition called Tethered to Light. There are classes taking place at AVA in person and online. This Zoom capability that we have is brought to us by the generosity of the state of New Hampshire and the CARES Act, and we want to use it to our fullest extent. So take some online classes, come to some in-person classes, keep watching us on Zoom, and we hope to see you again real soon. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.